The ringtone hadn't changed in 7 years. A mournful trumpet solo, the theme from The Postman. Irony wasn't lost on Dan Reyes, not anymore. He almost didn't answer. Let it go to voicemail. Another wrong number. Another echo of a life he'd deliberately dismantled. Made him reach for the landline. Still refused to get a cell. Too traceable. Reyes. His voice was rough, unused. Static crackled on the other end. Then a voice, deliberately roughened, speaking low. Dan, it is a friend. You need to look at what happened out by Black Canyon City. Black Canyon, what for? Pipeline, Central Arizona project. Blew last night. They're calling it an accident. The voice paused. Don't think it was. Dan frowned, pushing himself up from the worn recliner. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom of his small cabin. Who is this? The line went dead. He stared at the black receiver, his gut tightening. A friend. He hadn't had friends in years. Not since. Everything. He hung up, the silence amplifying the throb in his temples. The Central Arizona Project, CAP. The lifeblood of Phoenix, and increasingly the entire state. If a section went down, he hadn't followed the news closely. That had been the point. But even he knew the reservoir levels were critically low. Another drought year looming. This could be bad. Very bad. The chipped formica of his kitchen table was littered with old newspapers, mostly local throwaways he picked up when he drove into town for supplies. The walls were plastered with maps, topographical maps of Arizona, old irrigation diagrams, resource allocation reports. Remnants of a past life, a life that had ended in flames. He hadn't always lived like this, a hermit holed up in a decaying cabin 20 miles outside of Prescott. He'd been Dan Reyes, investigative reporter, a rising star at the Phoenix New Times, until he wasn't. The flashbacks came unbidden, shards of a shattered memory. The Chandler family, the sprawling real estate empire built on shady land deals, the whispers of corruption, the backroom meetings, the missing public records. He'd been close, so close to exposing a network of bribery, reaching into the highest levels of state government. He'd had the documents, the sources, the proof. Then, the retraction, the fabricated evidence planted in his files. The source he'd trusted, revealed as a paid informant for Chandler's lawyers. The public dismantling, the accusations of journalistic malpractice, the loss of his job, his reputation, his fiancé. He'd been relentless, certain of his facts, until he wasn't. The doubt, meticulously sown, took root. He challenged the retraction, fought for his career. But the damage was done. The paper, eager to avoid a protracted lawsuit, had thrown him under the bus. He'd walked away, disgusted with the system, with himself. Sarah, unable to withstand the fallout, had left, said she needed someone stable, someone she could trust. He hadn't blamed her. He hadn't even tried to stop her. He'd retreated here, to the high desert, seeking anonymity and oblivion. A self-imposed exile. He'd told himself he was done with truth, with justice, with everything. He'd become a ghost, haunting the edges of a life he no longer recognized. The drive to Black Canyon City was slow, the landscape a harsh palette of ochre and scrub. The CAP pipeline snaked across the valley floor, a massive concrete artery carrying water from the Colorado River to the thirsty cities of central Arizona. It was an engineering marvel and a political battleground. The explosion site was cordoned off with yellow tape, but the devastation was evident even from the road. 100 yards of the concrete structure had been reduced to rubble, twisted metal, and scorched earth. The air still smelled of diesel and something else, something acrid and chemical. A lone state trooper stood guard, looking bored. A handful of technicians in hazmat suits moved slowly around the wreckage, collecting samples. Dan parked his beat-up Ford pickup a safe distance away and watched. "Can I help you, sir?" the trooper asked, ambling over. "Just observing," Dan said, keeping his voice neutral. "Heard about the explosion." "Yeah, messy business. They're saying a mechanical failure, pressure build-up, something like that." The trooper shrugged. "Happens sometimes with these old lines." Dan doubted it. The cap was meticulously maintained. He'd covered its construction years ago. "Any witnesses?" "Not really. It is a pretty isolated stretch of highway. Couple of truckers saw a flash, reported it. That is about it." He walked closer to the wreckage, ignoring the trooper's warning to stay back. The blast had been focused, almost surgically precise. Too precise for a simple mechanical failure. He knelt down, examining the shattered concrete. There were scorch marks, but also something that looked like tool marks. Cuts made with diamond, tipped saws, evidence of deliberate sabotage. He scanned the surrounding landscape. The desert was a master of concealment. Any tracks would have been covered by the wind and the shifting sands. But then he saw it. Spray painted on a nearby rock face. A stark black symbol. A spiral contained within a triangle, intersected by jagged lines. He felt a jolt of recognition, a cold dread creeping up his spine. He hadn't seen that symbol in almost 20 years. It was the mark of the Guardians of the Earth, a radical environmental group, active in the early 90s, known for acts of eco-terrorism. They'd been linked to several pipeline attacks, mostly in California and Oregon. He'd written a brief article about them early in his career, before they faded into obscurity. What were they doing here, in Arizona? And why now? Arizona's water rights were a tangled web of historical claims, political maneuvering, and sheer desperation. The state had grown explosively in the last 50 years, fueled by cheap water and a blistering sun. But that growth had come at a cost. The Colorado River was shrinking, depleted by decades of overuse and a changing climate. The groundwater basins were being overdrafted, and the reservoirs were dwindling. The major players were entrenched. The ranchers who held some of the oldest water rights in the state, fiercely protective of their access to irrigation. The developers, eager to build more subdivisions and golf courses, pushing for looser regulations and new water sources. And the Native American tribes, whose ancestral lands bordered the Colorado River, fighting to protect their sacred water sources and treaty rights. The Hualapai, Havasupai, and Navajo Nation all struggled with water scarcity, their communities already feeling the impacts of the drought. They'd been locked in legal battles with the state and private companies for years, demanding a greater share of the dwindling resource. The situation was a powder keg, and the pipeline explosion was a spark. Dan understood with growing certainty that this wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a statement, a warning, a calculated move in a much larger, more dangerous game. He thought of the online news outlet, Arizona Sentinel, run by a former colleague, Maria Sanchez. She'd reached out a few months ago, asking if he'd contribute the occasional investigative piece. He'd refused, content with his solitude. But maybe this was different. Maybe he couldn't stay on the sidelines any longer. He drove to Maria's office, a cramped space above a Mexican bakery in downtown Phoenix. The smell of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air. Maria, a whirlwind of energy and sharp intelligence, listened to his story, her brow furrowed. She hadn't heard about the symbol. "Sabotage," she said, when he'd finished. "That is huge, Dan, if you're right." "I don't know if I'm right," he cautioned. "It is just a feeling, and that symbol, it bothers me. Let's dig into it. I can pull up old files, see if anything matches. We need to talk to some experts, get a better understanding of the water rights situation." She paused, her eyes searching his. "Look, I know what happened. I know what they did to you. But this isn't about them anymore. This is about the water, about the people who depend on it. Arizona needs someone to look into this, someone who knows how to connect the dots. And you, Dan, you're the best I know." He hesitated. Going back into the fray meant risking everything, reopening old wounds, facing the ghosts of his past. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the only one who could see the bigger picture. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." "Good." Maria smiled, a flash of hope in her eyes. "I'll set up a meeting with a hydrologist tomorrow morning, and I'll start researching the guardians of the earth." They were wrapping up, finalizing a list of sources for initial contact, when Maria's phone rang. It was the state trooper from Black Canyon City. "Sanchez," she answered, listening intently. Her expression changed, hardening with each word. She looked at Dan, her voice tight. "They found something else at the site." "A body." "A body?" Dan asked, his blood turning to ice. "Not just any body," Maria said, her gaze locked on his. "They found the body of Ben Teller, the Hualapai tribal water lawyer. He'd been leading the fight for increased water allocations for the tribe." The trooper's voice crackled through the phone. "And there is something else, Miss Sanchez. Spray, painted next to the body. The same symbol. The triangle and the spiral." The smell of stale coffee and simmering frustration clung to the air at the Roadrunner diner, just outside of Kingman. Dan nursed a lukewarm cup, the chipped ceramic warm against his calloused hands. He'd spent the morning talking to ranchers, men and women whose families had scratched a living from this harsh land for generations, and the anger was palpable. "They're bleedin', us dry, Reyes." Old man Hemlock had rasped, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and wind. "Phoenix doesn't know the value of a single drop of water. They just turn on the tap and expect it to flow. Don't care about folks like us out here." The sentiment was echoed in every conversation. The ranchers weren't necessarily against progress, but they resented the unchecked growth of the cities, the sprawling golf courses, the lush lawns in the desert. They saw the water being diverted to fuel a lifestyle that felt alien, wasteful. "It ain't about the water, not really." Another rancher, a younger woman named Sarah Jenkins, had told him, "It is about respect. They don't respect this land. They don't respect our way of life. They think they can just take what they want." Dan listened, taking notes, his reporter's instincts slowly reawakening. The ranchers weren't advocating for violence, but the resentment was a fertile ground for it. A spark could easily ignite a wildfire. He wondered if Ben Teller's death was that spark. Back at Maria's office, the Arizona Sentinel humming with a low thrum of digital activity. He focused on the symbol. Maria had unearthed a few obscure references to the guardians of the earth, but nothing concrete. It was as if they de-vanished into thin air after a few high-profile arrests in the late 90s. But then he dove deeper, searching old newspaper archives, focusing on Arizona. That is when he found it, a small, almost forgotten article from 1978 detailing a land dispute in the Verde Valley. The dispute involved the Salton family, wealthy ranchers owning vast tracts of land, and the Yazzie family, a prominent member of the Hualapai Nation. The Saltons had been accused of illegally diverting water from a tributary of the Verde River, depriving the Yazzie people of their rightful share. The dispute had escalated into a series of skirmishes, legal battles, and accusations of intimidation. The article mentioned a symbol, a stylized spiral within a triangle used by a group of Salton supporters to protest the Yazzie. The resemblance was uncanny. He pulled up everything he could find on the Saltons. They were still powerful, still influential. Old man Howard Salton had passed away a few years ago, but his children and grandchildren continued to run the family empire. They were deeply connected to Arizona politics, major donors to both Republican and Democratic campaigns. He felt a prickle of unease. The timing of the pipeline attacks, the symbol, the murder of a tribal lawyer. It was all starting to feel connected, but the Saltons were untouchable. Taking them on would be like poking a bear with a toothpick. Before he could delve further, Maria burst into the office, her face pale. Another one, Dan, another pipeline hit. This time, it is the Canal 14 near Buckeye. He swore under his breath. A second attack, so soon after the first. This wasn't random, it was a coordinated campaign. They used a different method this time, Maria said, her voice tight. More sophisticated. Explosives experts are saying it wasn't just a pipe bomb, it was professionally made. Professional, that meant money, planning, expertise. The Guardians of the Earth hadn't struck him as capable of that kind of operation. Unless they'd been revived and funded by someone with deep pockets. He felt a growing sense of dread. This was escalating quickly. He decided to pay a visit to Sheriff Brody, the law enforcement official in charge of the investigation. Brody was a childhood acquaintance, a year behind Dan in school. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Dan had left Prescott. Brody's office was small and cluttered, the walls covered with hunting trophies and framed photographs of his family. He greeted Dan with a weary sigh and a curt nod. "Reyes," Brody said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you around here again." "Just doing some research, Sheriff," Dan said, keeping his tone neutral. "I heard about the attacks." "Yeah, messy business. State's handling it. They think it is some kind of environmental group." "I think it might be more complex than that," Dan said, carefully outlining his findings about the Saltons and the historical land dispute. Brody listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "You're reaching, Reyes, connecting dots that aren't there. The Saltons are pillars of this community. They wouldn't resort to violence. Maybe not directly, but they have a history of being ruthless." Brody let out a harsh laugh. "Look, I remember your reputation, Reyes. Always chasing shadows, looking for a story where there wasn't one. You burned yourself out, and for good reason. Don't come back here trying to stir up trouble. This is my jurisdiction. I'm just trying to help, Sheriff. Help yourself by staying out of this." Brody's eyes narrowed. "I know what happened in Phoenix. I read the reports. Don't let that happen here." Dan swallowed his anger. Brody wasn't interested in the truth. He was protecting his friends, his community, and maybe even his own career. He knew he wouldn't get anywhere with him. He needed more information, more history. He drove to the Kingman Historical Society, a small, unassuming building filled with dusty artifacts and forgotten memories. Old man Peterson, the society's curator, was a wizened man with a twinkle in his eye and the encyclopedic knowledge of local history. Dan explained his research, carefully omitting his suspicions about the Saltons. He simply asked about the historical land dispute between the Saltons and the Yazzie family. Peterson's face grew somber. "Ah, the Salton-Yazzie feud. A dark chapter in our history. It started over water rights, as most disputes in this state do. But it was more than that. It was about power, about control. The Saltons believed they were entitled to the land, that they had the right to exploit its resources. The Yazzie people, of course, saw it differently. They had lived on that land for generations, their lives intertwined with the river and the desert. They believed they were the stewards of the land, not its owners." He pointed to a faded photograph on the wall. It showed two men facing off, their expressions grim. One was Howard Salton, the patriarch of the ranching family. The other was Chief Samuel Yazzie, a revered leader of the Hualapai Nation. They were bitter enemies, Peterson said. They clashed over everything: land, water, politics. There were threats, intimidation, even violence. The feud simmered for decades, poisoning relations between the two families. He paused, his eyes clouding with memory. There were rumors, of course, whispers of secret agreements, clandestine deals, and ancient grudges. Some people said the symbol, the spiral and the triangle, represented the Yazid's sacred connection to the land. The Sultans adopted it as a symbol of defiance, a way to mock the tribe. It became a symbol of division, of hatred. It is a shame to see it resurfacing now. Dan left the historical society, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was becoming more disturbing. He felt like he was walking into a hornet's nest, and he knew with a growing sense of certainty that he was being watched. He checked his phone as he walked to his truck. One new message: no caller ID. Stop digging, Reyes. Some things are better left buried. The message was short, chilling. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Someone knew he was investigating. Someone wanted him to back off. And they weren't afraid to threaten him. He looked around, scanning the parking lot, searching for any sign of surveillance. He was alone, but he didn't feel alone. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that he was no longer a ghost. He was a target. The dust tasted like regret as Dan drove the long, winding road to the Salton ranch. He spent the last 24 hours constructing a plausible identity. A freelance agricultural journalist, working on a piece about innovative irrigation techniques in the arid Southwest. He even created a rudimentary website and a LinkedIn profile to support the fabrication. It felt dirty. A necessary evil, he told himself. He hadn't lied like this in years. The ranch was everything he'd imagined. Sprawling, opulent, a fortress of wealth carved out of the desert. White stucco walls, manicured lawns irrigated by a network of sprinklers. A particularly galling sight given the state's drought, and a long, gated driveway that felt like a declaration of ownership. He presented his credentials to a stone-faced security guard who scrutinized him with open suspicion. After a tense 5 minutes and a phone call to someone simply referred to as Mr. Jed, he was waved through. The party was in full swing. 100 or so guests milled around the expansive patio, sipping cocktails and sampling hors d'oeuvres. The air thrummed with the forced conviviality of old money. Cowboy hats and designer dresses mingled under strings of fairy lights. A country band played a mournful tune, the steel guitar weeping over the desert air. He spotted Caleb Salton almost immediately, holding court amongst a group of admirers, a man in his late 70s, with a weathered face and eyes that held a lifetime of hard bargains. He exuded power, an aura of unyielding authority. Beside him, radiating a restless energy, was Jed Salton, his son, younger, sharper, and with a predatory glint in his eye. Dan made his way through the crowd, keeping his profile low, acutely aware of being an outsider. He observed the Saltons, studying their interactions. The dynamic between Caleb and Jed was complicated, a simmering tension beneath a facade of respect. Caleb seemed to view Jed as a capable but impulsive heir, while Jed chafed under his father's controlling influence. He overheard snippets of conversation, carefully crafted to sound innocuous but loaded with meaning. "We need to protect what is ours," a silver-haired woman in a pearl necklace said to a man in a Stetson. "These people think they can just take what they want." "They've been stealing from us for too long," the man replied, his voice low and gravelly. "It is time to take back what was stolen." The language was ambiguous, but Dan knew they weren't talking about cattle. They were talking about water and power. He managed to corner Caleb Salton near the buffet table, grabbing a plate of shrimp cocktail as a flimsy excuse to engage him. "Salton," he said, extending his hand. "Daniel Reyes, from Southwest Agri Report. I was hoping to get your thoughts on the latest advancements in water conservation." Caleb shook his hand, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, cold and assessing, seemed to see right through him. "Water conservation is important, Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. But it is also about responsible management, about ensuring that those who have contributed to the growth of this state are not penalized for the mistakes of others. Dan pressed cautiously. I've heard concerns about the recent pipeline attacks. Obviously, a major disruption to the water supply affects everyone. Caleb's smile didn't reach his eyes. Accidents happen, Mr. Reyes. Sometimes things break. It is unfortunate, but it is part of life. Some are suggesting sabotage, Dan persisted. Caleb's gaze hardened. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Let me give you a piece of advice, Mr. Reyes. Some stories are best left untold. Some questions are best left unasked. This is a good community, a welcoming community. But we don't take kindly to troublemakers. The veiled threat hung in the air. Dan forced a smile, a tight, brittle thing. Just doing my job, sir, he said, backing away slowly. I appreciate your time. He knew he'd overstayed his welcome. He'd rattled Caleb, and that was something, but he'd also painted a target on his back. He circulated, trying to look inconspicuous, gathering as much information as he could. But everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him, watching, assessing. He spotted Jed Salton, talking animatedly, with a man he didn't recognize. The man was impeccably dressed, wearing a dark suit despite the desert heat. They were standing near the edge of the patio, partially obscured by a row of potted cacti. He moved closer, straining to hear their conversation. The timing is crucial, Jed was saying, his voice low and urgent. Everything needs to be in place before the next monsoon hits. And the payment, the other man asked. It is arranged the full amount, as agreed. Jed glanced around nervously, then nodded towards a large black briefcase sitting at his feet. It is all there. Dan's breath hitched, a briefcase full of cash. What were they paying for? Suddenly, the sky darkened. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, whipping dust and debris across the patio. The partygoers murmured uneasily, glancing at the approaching storm. Then the rain came. Not a gentle drizzle, but a furious downpour. A typical Arizona monsoon. The party descended into chaos. Guests scrambled for cover, overturning tables and chairs in their haste. The band stopped playing, their instruments abandoned. The fairy lights flickered and died. It was the perfect cover. Dan seized the opportunity. He slipped away from the crowd. Melting into the deluge, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. He didn't look back, knowing that if he was spotted, he wouldn't be so lucky next time. He reached his truck, soaked to the bone, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he fumbled with the keys, he glanced back towards the ranch. Through the sheets of rain, he saw them again. Jed Salton and the unknown man, huddled together under the awning of the main house. Jed was handing the briefcase to the man. A flicker of lightning illuminated the man's face for a fleeting moment. Dan couldn't quite make out his features, but he saw something familiar, something that sent a shiver down his spine. He started the engine and peeled out, splashing through puddles, leaving the Salton ranch and a whole heap of trouble sooty behind him. He had a feeling this was just the beginning, and that the storm brewing wasn't just in the sky. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and heavy with humidity. Dan spent the morning scouring local records, poring over property deeds and water rights allocations. He needed to identify the man he'd seen exchanging the briefcase with Jed Salton. It was a long shot, but he had a face, or rather, a fleeting impression of one burned into his memory. He started with vehicle registrations, cross-referencing luxury cars seen in the Kingman area with out-of-state plates. After hours of dead ends, he got a hit, a black SUV registered to a Dr. Alistair Finch, a former hydrologist who'd once been a consultant for the Salton family. Finch had a checkered past. A brilliant but ethically flexible scientist, He'd been disgraced a decade ago after being accused of falsifying data in a water rights dispute. The Saltons had quietly distanced themselves from him, but Dan suspected they hadn't completely severed ties. He found Finch living in a dilapidated trailer park on the outskirts of Kingman, a stark contrast to the opulent world of the Salton ranch. The trailer was surrounded by stacks of old textbooks, scientific journals, and half-empty coffee cups. Finch answered the door, looking disheveled and defensive. "What do you want?" he rasped, his eyes bloodshot. Dan identified himself as a journalist, playing the same card he'd used with Caleb Salton. "I'm doing a story on water management in Arizona." "And your name came up," Finch scoffed. "Water management. That is a polite term for legalized theft." He hesitated, then invited Dan inside. The trailer smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. Dan got straight to the point. He showed Finch a photograph he'd discreetly snapped of him at the Salton ranch. Finch paled. "Where did you get that?" "I saw you with Jed Salton, exchanging a briefcase." Finch's resistance crumbled. He launched into a bitter, rambling monologue, filled with resentment and regret. He'd been approached by Jed Salton a few weeks ago, offered a substantial sum of money to consult on a project. He hadn't known the specifics, only that it involved disrupting the water supply. "They're trying to drive down land values," Finch explained, his voice trembling. "There is a new development going up near Black Canyon City, Harmony Springs, hundreds of homes, all reliant on cap water. The Saltons want to cut off their supply, make it uninhabitable. Then they can buy up the land for pennies on the dollar." "And the pipelines?" Dan asked. "Just collateral damage, a means to an end. They needed to create a crisis to justify the water restrictions." But there was more. Finch revealed a deeper, more sinister layer to the Saltons' plan. They don't just want the land. They want to regain control of the water rights held by the Yazzie tribe. Old Man Salton had a long-standing feud with Chief Yazzie. He believed the tribe was entitled to too much water. He spent his entire life trying to take it back. The Yazzie tribe's water rights were some of the most secure in the state, protected by treaty agreements and decades of legal battles. But the Saltons, with their wealth and influence, were determined to undermine them. "They're playing a dangerous game." "Mr. Reyes," Finch said, his eyes filled with fear. "They're willing to do anything to get what they want." Dan confronted Jed Salton later that afternoon, tracking him to an abandoned pumping station a few miles outside of Kingman. The station was a relic of a bygone era, a rusting metal skeleton looming over the desert landscape. "You're playing with fire, Salton," Dan said, his voice tight with anger. He'd bypassed the guard station, relying on his knowledge of the old access roads. Jed, predictably, denied everything. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence. I know about the briefcase, about Finch. I know about your plan to sabotage Harmony Springs and steal the Yazzie's water rights." Jed's face darkened. He signaled to two hulking figures who emerged from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, Reyes," Jed said, his voice cold and menacing. "This is a private matter." A tense standoff ensued. Dan was outnumbered, outsized, but he wasn't unarmed. He had a small, concealed pistol, Sati a relic from his past. A reminder of a time when he'd had to protect himself. He didn't want to use it, but he wasn't afraid to. "This isn't about a private matter, Salton. This is about people's lives, about the future of Arizona." Jed laughed. "Sentimentality. You haven't changed, have you? Still chasing windmills?" Jed lunged at him, and the fight began. It was brutal, chaotic, a desperate struggle for survival. Dan managed to disarm one of the guards, using his street smarts and years of pent-up frustration to his advantage. But Jed was relentless. a physically imposing man with a ruthless streak. During the struggle, Dan noticed something horrifying. The pumping station was rigged with explosives. Wires snaked across the floor, connected to a series of high-powered detonators. Jed had planned to blow the entire station, causing a catastrophic collapse that would disrupt the water supply for miles. "What are you doing?" Dan gasped, struggling to break free from Jed's grip. "Finishing what my father started," Jed snarled. "Taking back what is ours." Dan knew he had to act fast. He managed to reach the control panel, frantically cutting wires, disabling the detonators. Sparks flew, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning metal. The station shuddered. The ground vibrated. For a moment, he thought he'd failed. But then, the shaking stopped. He'd done it. He'd disabled the explosive device. But Jed was already gone. He'd used the chaos to escape, disappearing into the desert. Dan stumbled out of the pumping station, breathless and battered. He scanned the area, searching for Jed, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then he saw it. Lying near the control panel, discarded in the rush to escape, was a small, leather-bound notebook. Jed's notebook. He picked it up, his hands trembling. He flipped it open, and his blood ran cold. The notebook was filled with meticulous notes, detailed plans, and financial records. It laid bare the Salton's conspiracy, revealing a web of bribery, intimidation, and sabotage. And most damningly, it included signed memos from Caleb Salton, authorizing the attacks on the pipelines, and directing Jed to eliminate any obstacles in their path. Caleb Salton, the patriarch, the pillar of the community, he'd been the mastermind all along. Dan stared at the evidence, a grim sense of satisfaction washing over him. He'd exposed them. He'd finally brought them down. But as he looked up, scanning the horizon, he knew this was far from over. Jed Salton was still out there, and Caleb Salton, protected by his wealth and influence, would not go down without a fight. The weight of water, he realized, wasn't just about the scarcity of a vital resource. It was about the weight of secrets, the weight of betrayal, and the weight of a legacy of greed. And he was now squarely in the middle of it all. Sheriff Morales wasn't pleased to see him. The lines around his mouth were etched deeper, his gaze colder than Dan remembered. But Morales, despite his initial skepticism, was a man of the law, even if that law was often bent to the will of Kingman's elite. The evidence, carefully laid out on Morales' cluttered desk, Finch's deposition, the photographs from the pumping station, the excerpts from Jed's notebook Thufen, was hard to ignore. "This is damning," Morales admitted, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But Caleb Salton, he has been good to this town. A lot of people owe him. He has been manipulating this town, Sheriff," Dan countered, his voice steady. "He has been stealing water from the Yazzie tribe for decades. And now he is willing to resort to violence. Violence is a strong word. The pipelines, the pumping station. It is not an accident, Morales. It is a coordinated attack, and Caleb Salton is the one pulling the strings." Morales sighed. He knew Dan wasn't prone to exaggeration, and he'd known Dan's father, a man of integrity and principle. He'd reluctantly agreed to open an investigation, but he warned Dan, "Don't expect this to be easy. Salton's got lawyers, influence. He'll fight this every step of the way." His prediction proved accurate almost immediately. Within hours, a smear campaign began, orchestrated by Salton's legal team. Articles appeared in the local paper questioning Dan's credibility, dredging up the details of his past scandal. Anonymous sources whispered accusations of fabricated evidence and a personal vendetta against the Salton family. Morales, visibly uncomfortable, called Dan into his office. "I'm getting pressure, Reyes, from the county attorney, from the Chamber of Commerce. They want me to back off." "Don't let them," Dan urged. This is about more than just politics, Morales. This is about justice. He knew, deep down, that he was fighting an uphill battle. Caleb Salton wasn't he just wealthy and powerful, he was deeply entrenched in the fabric of Arizona society. He built a legacy of influence and control, and he wouldn't let anyone dismantle it without a fight. The origins of the Salton Yazzie feud stretched back to the late 19th century, a time of broken promises and land grabs, flashbacks, unbidden, assaulted Dan, images pieced together from historical records. He saw a younger Caleb, Salton's grandfather, Ezekiel Salton, a ruthless cattle baron, arriving in the Arizona territory with nothing but ambition and a thirst for land. He'd negotiated a treaty with Chief Yazzie, promising the tribe access to water and grazing rights in exchange for a portion of their ancestral lands. But Ezekiel Salton was a liar. As soon as he'd secured the land, he'd begun to renege on his promises, diverting water away from the Yazzie people, claiming that they were using it inefficiently. Chief Yazzie had fought back, but he was ultimately outmatched. The Saltons had the law on their side, the politicians in their pocket. The treaty was subtly revised, the Yazzie's water rights diminished. Over the years, the Saltons had continued to exploit the tribe, slowly eroding their access to the lifeblood of the desert. The seeds of resentment had been sown, nurtured by generations of injustice. And now, Caleb Salton was trying to finish what his grandfather had started. He needed an ally, someone who understood the Yazzie perspective, someone who could help him navigate the complex legal landscape of water rights. He found that ally in Sarah Yazzie, a sharp, determined lawyer who had dedicated her life to fighting for her tribe. He met her at the Yazzie tribal offices, a modest building on the outskirts of Kingman. Sarah listened intently as he laid out his findings, her expression growing increasingly grim. "We've suspected something like this for a long time," she said, her voice tight with anger. "But we've never had the evidence to prove it. Your information, it is a game changer." "I need your help, Sarah," Dan said. "I need to understand the nuances of the treaty, the historical water rights claims. I need to know where the Saltons are vulnerable." Sarah agreed to help, offering access to the tribe's legal archives and her own expertise. She showed him the original treaty, a faded document written in archaic legalese. She pointed out a specific clause, almost hidden in the fine print, that had been intentionally overlooked for over a century. "This clause," she said, her voice trembling with excitement, "states that if the Salton family ever attempts to restrict water access to downstream users, the tribe's original water rights are automatically reinstated, superseding all subsequent agreements." It was a bombshell. If they could prove that the Saltons were deliberately restricting water to Harmony Springs, they could overturn decades of legal precedent and restore the Yazzie tribe's full water rights. This changes everything," Dan breathed, recognizing the potential fallout. He returned to his truck late that night, exhausted but energized. He started the engine, but it didn't turn over. He tried again. Nothing. He got out and inspected the engine. A wire had been cut, cleanly severed. Sabotage, a clear warning from the Saltons. He ran his hand over the cool metal of the car, a shiver running down his spine. They were sending a message. They were letting him know that they were watching him, that they were capable of anything. He looked up, scanning the darkness. He was alone, exposed. He was playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than ever. Suddenly his phone buzzed. It was an anonymous text message. "You're getting too close. Back off, or you'll regret it." He ignored the threat, but a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He knew with a chilling certainty that this was just the beginning. As he walked back towards the tribal offices to call for a ride, he received another notification on his phone. It was from Sarah Yazzie. "You need to come here now. I've found something you won't believe." The message was terse, urgent. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. When he arrived at the tribal offices, Sarah was pale and shaken, staring at a newly discovered document. "I found this hidden in a private archive," she whispered, handing him a brittle yellowed parchment. "It is a secret addendum to the original treaty, a clause that was deliberately suppressed by the Sultans. It doesn't just reinstate the Yazidi rights, it invalidates all water rights claims based on subsequent decrees. It essentially throws Arizona's entire water allocation system into chaos." The courtroom was packed, a sweltering box of anticipation and animosity. Every seat was filled, spilling out into the hallway. Local reporters, tribal elders, ranchers, developers, they all wanted to witness the downfall of Caleb Salton. Dan sat beside Sarah Yazidi, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. It felt surreal, being back in the arena of public scrutiny. A far cry from his quiet life in the mountains. Sarah presented the addendum to the treaty, the suppressed clause that invalidated all subsequent water rights, with a quiet, devastating force. The courtroom held its breath as she detailed the Salton family's decades-long deception, their systematic exploitation of the Yazidi tribe, and their ruthless pursuit of control. Caleb Salton, seated at the defense table, radiated an icy contempt. He hadn't changed his tune, continuing to portray himself as a benevolent benefactor, a pillar of the community. His lawyers argued that the addendum was a forgery, a desperate attempt by the Yazidi tribe to undermine legitimate land claims. But Dan had anticipated their defense. He'd spent weeks tracking down Dr. Finch, convincing him to testify against the Sultans. Finch, haunted by his complicity in their schemes, delivered a damning account of his involvement, confirming the authenticity of the addendum and detailing the Sultans' deliberate manipulation of data. The prosecution, led by a surprisingly zealous Sheriff Morales, hammered home the point: Caleb Salton hadn't just violated water rights, he'd committed fraud, conspiracy, and attempted sabotage. He'd endangered the lives of countless people. The turning point came during Caleb's cross-examination. The prosecutor presented Jed Salton's notebook, laying bare the meticulous planning of the pipeline attacks and the bribery of local officials. Caleb, caught off guard, attempted to deflect, to blame his son, but the evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom erupted. Accusations flew. Tempers flared. The Salton family, once untouchable, crumbled before the eyes of the public. Finally, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Caleb Salton to 20 years in prison, a symbolic end to his reign of power. The Salton Empire began to unravel almost immediately. Assets were seized, lawsuits were filed, and the family's reputation lay in tatters. The Yazidi tribe erupted in celebration. The courtroom transformed into a scene of joyous pandemonium. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, embraced Dan, her gratitude palpable. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We finally did it." The judge's ruling not only secured the Yazidi tribe's water rights, but also triggered a lengthy legal process to re-evaluate all existing water allocations in Arizona. It was a messy, complicated undertaking, but it was a necessary one. The state's water system, built on a foundation of injustice and unsustainable practices, was finally being forced to reckon with its past. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Dan found himself thrust back into the world of journalism, fielding calls from news outlets across the country. He wrote a series of articles for the Arizona Sentinel, detailing the Sultan's conspiracy, the Yazidi tribe's struggle, and the urgent need for water reform. His work was exhaustive, meticulous, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't seeking recognition or redemption. He simply wanted to tell the truth. He visited Sarah at the Yazidi tribal offices. The mood was buoyant, hopeful. The tribe was already developing plans for sustainable water management, investing in new technologies, and working with local communities to conserve resources. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said, her eyes shining with determination. We have a long way to go, but for the first time in generations, we have a future where our people can thrive, where our traditions can be preserved. He found himself drawn back into the community, attending tribal ceremonies, listening to the stories of the Yazzie people. He learned about their history, their culture, their deep connection to the land. He felt a sense of belonging, something he hadn't experienced in years. His cabin in the mountains no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. He sold it, using the proceeds to establish a small foundation dedicated to supporting environmental journalism and advocating for water justice. The monsoon season ended, leaving behind a landscape transformed. The desert bloomed. The reservoirs refilled, and the air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. Dan stood on a hilltop overlooking Phoenix, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He'd received a letter from his sister, a tentative olive branch, after years of silence. She'd read his articles, she said, and she was proud of him. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. He hadn't heard from Sarah in several weeks, consumed as she was with the myriad details of rebuilding the tribal water system. He missed her fiery spirit, her unwavering commitment. He knew they couldn't go back to the way things were, but he hoped they could forge a new kind of relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. He checked his phone, expecting nothing, but there was a message, anonymous, no caller ID. His heart pounded. He steeled himself, bracing for a threat, a warning. But the message contained only a single word: remember. He stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. The word resonated with ambiguity. Remember what? The sacrifices made, the lessons learned, or something else entirely. He knew instinctively that this wasn't the end of the story. The forces he'd uncovered were far-reaching, deeply entrenched. Caleb Salton might be behind bars, but his legacy of greed and corruption would linger. He had faced down the storm, but the desert held secrets still, and he, Dan Reyes, was no longer a ghost. He was a witness, and he would remember.